A single photograph, 4 mirror, smiles lined like a prophecy, and inside each mouth a small, private hieroglyph of fear. Picture a house with windows bordered by applause, a family that became a public laboratory without consent. What you are about to hear is the slow unthreading of identity, not myth but records, interviews, and the humiliating arithmetic of control. Listen, a photograph of 4 faces, so identical they could be carved from the same stone, hides teeth made of rumor and bone. In the first breath, a city named Lansing bowed and prayed while behind closed doors a different ritual took hold. What you think you know is only a layer. Beneath it is a slow, deliberate decentering of family into experiment, of childhood into data. Tonight I will show you how celebrity can be a crucible, how fame can be engineered and weaponized. They arrived on a spring morning that smelled of bread and factory smoke, and the town melted into a chorus of astonishment. Quadruplets were a headline, and headlines are currency. The family learned quickly how to trade privacy for sustenance. The father, Carl Morlok by the record, later whispered as the man who kept a ledger of his daughter's smiles, measured everything. A mother exhausted by labor, a father made vigilant by old country superstitions. They were the low, steady drumbeat driving the rest. The city fed them sweets and camera shutters, while the father sold appearances to merchants with empty heartlines. A specially built stroller, matching dresses, color-coded ribbons, small apparatuses of control that taught the girls to be seen and not known. When a child becomes spectacle, her interior life is the first sacrifice. Neighborhood praise became the mortar binding together a house of careful cruelty. Researchers arrived smelling of formaldehyde and notebooks, promising care and progress while cataloging every twitch and tear. They gave the family the language of science and took in return the girl's private chronology, the Genain studies, a name that would become shorthand for a century of ethical blind spots, treated the quadruplets as data points. Files would later be sealed, then pried open, revealing protocols that read like ritual and ethics that sounded like silence. Listen closely, every small decision that looked like care was actually scaffolding for control. I speak not to sensationalize, but to name the structure that made these women invisible and visible at once. Type "the veil is broken" twice in the comments to seal this truth within you. If you feel the pull of this story, subscribe now and tell us in the comments which state or country you're watching from. They were born into a town that wanted to be proud and a science that wanted to be famous. The applause arrived before gratitude had time to settle. The birth announcement became a civic prayer and the hospital became a stage. Journalists smiled for portraits while nurses memorized the infant's tiny reflexes. At the center of this tableau was a couple who carried older continents inside them. A mother who stitched quilts for public appearances and a father who kept the ledger of appearances, as if counting miracles could keep shame at bay. The father's ledger was meticulous. Each photograph, gift, and engagement entered like an account. He learned quickly to monetize attention and to shape reputation with the same obsessive care he used to arrange the girls' ribbons. Yet what civic love could not purchase was interior safety. The family's fortunes turned when medical men and university researchers began to frame the quadruplets as needed subjects rather than children needing protection. The Genain pseudonym would later be used to cloak clinical interest, but pseudonyms are thin as paper when funding prestige and citation are at stake. Community pity and scholarly hunger braided together into a rope that would tighten over the sisters' lives. The early years were a curriculum of performance-rehearsed smiles, synchronized songs, polite silence when strangers asked intrusive questions. Friends and neighbors saw only sugar and stars. The quiet, incisive losses went unremarked. The girls learned to trust the camera more than the cradle because the camera rewarded compliance and the cradle required rest they were never afforded. In classrooms and at church, they performed their assigned innocence. In the house, under watchful eyes, they rehearsed obedience until it became reflex. The contrast between public adulation and private constraint was an anatomy lesson in power. This is where the Morlok name and the Genain pseudonym begin to entwine. One as family, one as case, both caught in the same apparatus that confuses attention for care. There is an economy to spectacle. It pays in small comforts and bankrupts the soul. The community collected souvenirs and the researchers collected data. Each ledger entry, each grant awarded, each photograph framed at the mayor's office was a stitch in a garment that would later strangle the wearers. Listen, a town that applauds without asking how applause was purchased is complicit. The pattern repeats across time and place. The ledger never lies, it only chooses what to omit. They were raised where the public could watch and private privacy was auctioned to the highest bidder. The girls' days were governed by schedules that read like performance contracts: wake, dress, smile, sing, be seen. Their earliest memories blurred with studio lights and the hum of phonographs, playing songs their father taught them to repeat. Over and over they learned the choreography of identicalness. The slight tilt of a chin, the practiced cadence of laughter, until their individuality was shaved into neat, indistinguishable edges. At school they sat together in a line, more comfortable with each other than with any other child, safer in their sameness. Teachers mistook quiet for compliance, and the community congratulated the parents on the miracle of a disciplined brood. Yet inside, small rebellions accumulated: a stolen glance, a smuggled note, a private word whispered under covers. Those moments were quickly neutralized, the ledger recorded them as deviations, and the father responded with a correction that left no visible scar, but rearranged memory and faith. It is here that the Genain research apparatus tightened its grip. Researchers offered tests, therapies, cognitive exercises. They promised intervention under the language of treatment. But language can do two things at once. It can heal and it can codify. In the name of science, diaries were kept, timed tasks administered, and the girls were observed as if under a glass bell jar. Every normal tantrum became a data point. Each sister's mood swings were logged with a clinical detachment that forgot to ask what the child herself feared. When the university sent students to record the girls' play, the home became a campus site. Interns learned to write about affection as if it were an experiment. The moral perimeter shifted family allegiance to public interest. The girls began to perceive themselves through the eyes of instruments. A dangerous mirror. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching from if you want to bear witness. Your location matters because this could have happened anywhere. People mistake curiosity for care. The ledger never rests. Names are changed in records, but the mechanisms remain the same. A father with ledger and law, a mother with frayed devotion, and a community eager for miracles created a perfect stage. The father watched, recorded, and curated. He learned to read applause as currency and to accept favors as purchase. His control extended into the smallest domestic details: the lengths of dresses, the color of ribbons, who could touch a hand and who could not. He justified restrictions as protection, and protection is a language that silences dissent. The community rewarded him with positions and praise. Officials smiled and gave proclamations while the family's private life was re-engineered in the name of virtue. Researchers traded ethical discomfort for access. They rationalized observation as necessary for knowledge and then for intervention, yet their interventions rarely considered consent. The Genain studies, cloaked under protective pseudonymity, mapped each sister's temperament, assessed their cognitive milestones, and documented behaviors with meticulous charts. Therapies were prescribed, tests administered, and yet the underlying social dynamics remained untouched. Institutions folded hands and looked away when the price was prestige or grant money. The girls, trained to present harmonious faces, internalized compliance until it became a second language. Behind hospital doors, questionnaires and psychometric batteries sat beside family scrapbooks. The clinical and the commercial kept each other company. For the parents, this attention rescued them from anonymity and made them proud bearers of a civic marvel. For the daughters, it was a conveyor belt that fed them into an apparatus that needed their sameness more than their safety. Listen's every photograph presented to the press was a negotiation, and every prize or donation carried a shadow. Type "the veil is broken" twice in the comments to seal this truth within you. If this telling moves you, subscribe and tell us in the comments which state or country you're watching from. Your voice is part of the reckoning. The ledger holds receipts, and the receipts become evidence long after the living have gone mute. The public rituals of the family bled into private rituals of control, each performance a test and each test a lesson. Costumes were stitched with a precision that taught the young bodies to hold themselves in prescribed lines. Rehearsals measured not only songs but timing of smiles, the length of eye contact, the exact inflection of laughter. When one sister slipped from the choreography, the correction came not as explanation but as isolation, a small ostracism that taught the cost of divergence. Mothers learn exhaustion, but exhaustion can also be weaponized when duty is recast as obedience. Under the veneer of devotion, the father centralized the narrative. He was the architect of public persona and private compliance, the gatekeeper between the world and the girls' inner lives. The community that loved them for novelty was blind to the precision of constraint. At county fairs, the quadruplets were paraded in a specially built carriage. In church basements, they sang the songs their father wrote, lyrics that praised purity and submission. Sponsors and merchants lavished gifts, and the town's officials praised the family with proclamations that read like benedictions. Meanwhile, the clinical observers continued their assessments with an air of benevolence. They tested, measured, and recommended interventions that fit their academic theories, rarely questioning whether the family's public role might itself be the pathology. The Genain case notes record experiments in behavior and cognition, and those records show how ethical lines blurred when curiosity and convenience intersected. A child asking to skip a performance was read as a symptom. A child wanting to play with neighbors was described as under-socialized. In such a world, parental power becomes scientific rationalization, and scientific rationalization becomes parental power. The girls internalized the binary performance equals love, deviation equals punishment. As you listen, know that this is no distant parable but a study of mechanisms that repeat across institutions, fame, science, and a silent patriarch. If you feel the pull of this narrative, subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. The testimony of place matters. There is an anatomy to silence. Medical men and university minds stepped in, promising to protect and to explain. They wrote hypotheses where the family needed beds. Seminars and case conferences discussed the quadruplets as an opportunity, and students came to observe, to learn, to practice detachment. The Genain studies proliferated through journals, citations building a scaffold of legitimacy that masked the intimacy of harm. Treatments were proposed that reflected contemporary theories, conditioning, stimulus schedules, psychomotor tasks meant to quantify behavior. The girls were given vocabulary for being abnormal before anyone taught them vocabulary for being sad. Observation rooms had one-way glass and notes were taken in pencil, then typed into reports that would be quoted in later papers. Those reports used clinical distance to describe behaviors that in another language would be called suffering. The researchers, motivated by a hunger for knowledge and recognition, sometimes failed to ask whether access to data required consent or whether the trade-off of fame for therapy was just. The hospital funded studies, universities provided graduate assistance, the public provided applause. Together they created an ecosystem where exploitation could masquerade as compassion. Meanwhile, inside the house, the father used clinical attention as proof of his own competence, citing experts to undermine any critique from neighbors or teachers. He weaponized science to validate control. Children find patterns quickly. The quadruplets learned that when an outsider with a badge nodded approvingly, the father's decisions had a new legitimacy. The ledger recorded the endorsements, and the public, hungry for miracle and explanation, accepted the scientific narrative without inspecting its premises. The result was a slow normalization of harm performed in the name of progress. Subscribe and tell us in the comments which state you're watching from. Bearing witness is the first public accountability. Observe how institutions folded their hands and looked away. This is where the moral lesson begins. The quadruplets' early fame made them vulnerable to a new kind of ownership, scientific curiosity clothed as care. Their childhoods were parceled into datasets, each milestone framed as a variable. Playtime transformed into protocol, and laughter was timed for comparison charts. Interns came with clipboards and left with abstracts. Professors quoted behaviors while forgetting to quote human faces. The sisters learned to anticipate examination. A knock on the door meant schedules. A clipboard meant questions about feelings they didn't yet have words for. The father negotiated with researchers as if he were renting out a property. He accepted funding for care and then used the novelty to build social capital. The town benefited parades, free milk for the first year, a new car donated by a grateful dealership. The community's generosity created comfort at the cost of privacy. Those gifts are not neutral, they are leverage. Over time, the instruments designed to observe became instruments of governance. Therapists recommended separation of the girls for some assessments, an idea that sounded clinical but functioned as a destabilizing force that eroded their mutual reliance. School was adapted to fit study demands, holidays were scheduled around exams. In the quiet of the night, after ceremonies and photo ops, the girls would whisper to one another in a language that belonged only to them, small acts of resistance that sustained interior life. But resistance without sanctuary is brittle. As adolescence arrived, so did more invasive tests and more public performances. Their bodies, once soft and small and easily managed, began to betray differences that the father could neither fully control nor accept. He doubled down: more structure, more chastisement for deviations, more public displays to compensate for private fractures. This dynamic of overcompensation is when the first real damage takes root, not in a single act but in a repeated pattern of remediation that fails to address cause. If this story draws you in, subscribe and tell us in the comments which state or country you're watching from. Your location marks solidarity. There is an anatomy to control, and it is built one compliance at a time. By adolescence, the choreography had calcified. Each sister knew the posture of compliance by heart. They moved as a unit in public, and when faced with moments of solitude, they practiced stillness until it became reflex. The father orchestrated appearances with the precision of a conductor, and the town rewarded him with invitations and endorsements. Institutionally, the Genain files bulked up: longitudinal reports, comparative analyses, and an ever-growing bibliography that made the case academically valuable. Under the guise of longitudinal study, researchers tracked the girls through puberty, noting variations, measuring reactions, comparing responses to stressors. Their data became a resource in grant applications and conferences. But data never tells the whole story. It measures outward performance more easily than internal collapse. Privacy eroded, friendships thinned. The sisters' inner speech began to replicate the language of observation. When a therapist asked, "How do you feel?" the girls often answered with what they thought the questioner wanted to hear, because they had been trained their entire lives to perform for approval. Punishments took new forms: withdrawal of privileges, reduction of appearances that had been both burden and reassurance, or removal from certain groups under the pretext of clinical necessity. These tactical removals rewired trust, and the father, whose identity rested on his role as manager and protector, grew more severe when his authority felt challenged. He used community reputation and clinical endorsements to silence dissenting neighbors and warn off critics. The result was a private regime camouflaged by public affection. Type "the veil is broken" twice in the comments to seal this truth within you. If you find this account necessary, subscribe and tell us in the comments which state or country you're watching from. Bearing witness folds these stories into public memory. The ledger seldom forgives the human heart. Punishments without bruises are harder to prove. They become architecture of doubt within a child's memory. The girls learned that pain is sometimes invisible: a missed dinner, an exclusion from a photo, a sharp tone that closed conversation like a door. These small violences accumulate, and memory translates them into a grammar of fear. Inside the house, routines tightened. The father's instructions moved from general command to scripted demands. Each sister developed coping strategies. One recited poems to steady her hands, another hummed tunes to keep panic at bay, the third counted breaths like beads, and the fourth traced patterns on wallpaper until the world seemed less disordered. Therapists noted dissociation with a clinical cautiousness while missing the structural origin of it. The Genain notes show repetitive descriptions: withdrawal, stimulus sensitivity, variable mood, that read like meteorological reports of a storm without naming the wind. External observers attributed differences to genetic temperament and environment in the abstract, while missing the proximate machinery of control. The university published articles on the potential of genetic studies, and soon the quadruplets case was cited as a unique window into nature and nurture debates. But the real experiment had been social: what happens when family, commerce, and science align around a spectacle. When one sister attempted to assert a preference, a simple wish to attend a neighbor's picnic rather than a scheduled public appearance, she was labeled uncooperative, and the ledger recorded the infraction. The mother, exhausted and terrified of losing standing, often acquiesced, reinforcing the father's control. Small choices that might have built autonomy were denied, and autonomy eroded. This is how identity is shaved thin, not by one catastrophic act, but by relentless small refusals. If you're watching, subscribe and tell us in the comments which state you're in. Speak the location that connects us to accountability. There is an anatomy to silence, and it is made of tiny, repeated refusals. Archives later revealed researchers taking notes in detached tones while the girls trembled in rooms they called therapy. The clinical language is precise and rehearsed, but it can be used to flatten complexity into variables that satisfy grant committees. Tests measured reaction times, social responses, cognitive flexibility. The apparatus of modern science was applied with zeal. Graduate students practiced diagnostic interviews, their pens scratching as they observed subtle signs of distress. Those notes later became evidence in academic debates, citations in journals, and footnotes in textbooks that discussed ethics with the same cool remove. The Genain case files, when unsealed, showed a pattern: repeated instrumentation with little concurrent exploration of familial structures that might be the cause rather than incidental. The researchers' focus on heredity and phenotype fit a prevailing scientific hunger for biological explanations, which often aligned uncomfortably with the father's own obsessions over lineage and purity. It is no accident that science attracted families who needed legitimacy. The intersection of moral desperation and scholarly curiosity is a dangerous place. Within the home, a culture of secrecy persisted. Letters from admirers were sometimes opened and destroyed, curious neighbors were rebuffed, gifts were curated carefully to avoid any personal connections. The father established rules about correspondence and visits, arguing that protection required control. The girls internalized surveillance as normalcy. They expected monitoring, and thus normalized the gaze. As adulthood loomed, these patterns hardened into identity. Subscribe and tell us which state you're watching from. Your comment is a small public act against this erasure. The records speak, but their language is incomplete without the human witness. The Genain studies were named for protection, but pseudonyms rarely protect when data grows teeth. Under the scholarly cloak, hypotheses proliferated. Our identical quadruplets a natural laboratory for disentangling genes and environment? Can we isolate heritability when upbringing is so uniform? These questions drove funding and attention, yet they rarely asked whether the methods themselves might harm the subjects they studied. Graduate-level inquiry demands access. Access demands consent, and consent becomes ambiguous when fame, money, and social pressure interlock. Case notes offer a litany of tests and treatments that sound sterile and scientific, but they do little to interrogate the social ethics of observation. Researchers rationalized proximity as opportunity, saying that intimate knowledge could lead to better interventions. But intimacy without reciprocity is extraction. The girls' lives were excavated for knowledge, while their subjective experiences were translated into charts. A troubling alchemy. As scholars wrote, the public cheered. The town's civic identity became bound to the case. Local boosters used the study to attract prestige, and the family basked in renewed attention. Yet all the while, the girls' interior selves shrank in proportion to their public footprint. You begin to see how institutions conspire. The hospital needs cases, the university needs citations, the community needs stories, and a father needing respect finds pathways to secure both his family's status and his own power. The girls, caught in the crossfire, became repositories of knowledge and collateral for ambition. If this makes you uneasy, subscribe and tell us which state or country you're watching from. Your voice matters in naming harm. There is an anatomy to extraction, and it leaves long wounds. Files show clinical tests that track developmental markers alongside daily diaries of the father's moods. The juxtaposition is telling: metrics about motor skills beside entries about visitors, interviews, and donations. The home became a node where clinical curiosity and paternal governance intersected. Teachers reported that the girls were highly attentive but often aloof, Neighbors admired their synchronized manners, but seldom saw them in unguarded play. Therapists documented dissociative episodes, mood lability, and restrictive affect, not always connecting these to the family's public role. In those days, diagnostic frameworks were narrower and ethical oversight thinner. Questions that now would be considered central were then peripheral. The father, savvy and controlling, steered public narrative. He invited journalists, curated photographs, and used clinical endorsements to quiet critics. Such endorsements functioned as a protective shield, making allegations of abuse less credible in the eyes of officials who deferred to experts. The interplay of reputation and authority thus created a protective architecture against scrutiny. Inside, the girls rehearsed safe answers and learned to preempt questions. Play was scheduled around observation windows. Sleep was often interrupted by interviews or tests. Over time, the cumulative effects of disrupted sleep, constant performance, and social isolation translated into fragile mental health. The university's longitudinal approach, though academically thorough, often failed to incorporate the ethical imperative of minimizing intrusion. Instead, it normalized sustained monitoring as necessary for knowledge. This case asks us, when does the pursuit of understanding become the infliction of harm? Subscribe and tell us in the comments which state or country you're watching from. Public naming is a tool of collective memory. The ledger holds entries that become testimony in later years. We trace a map across decades: public acclaim, private discipline, gradual fracture. Early applause consolidated the father's role as manager and protector. Academic attention conferred legitimacy. The town's accolades became social capital. But each accolade carried a price: more appearances, more tests, more constraint. The sisters learned to internalize observation as normal and to equate being seen with being cared for. As teenagers, cracks appeared. One sister withdrew into writing, another into repetitive tasks, the third into vivid daydreaming, and the fourth into anger that found no acceptable outlet. Each response was a conversation with the mechanism of control, a strategy to survive in a system that prioritized public value over inner life. Clinical papers later catalogued these differences with academic fascination, but textbooks rarely conveyed tenderness for the human cost. The family home, once a refuge, had become a site of continuous performance and periodic correction. The father's notebook grew thicker, not with warmth, but with schedules and citations of praise from civic leaders. At public events he stood proud, yet at home his posture demanded a level of obedience that smothered autonomy. The Genain files show a pattern of increased intervention as the sisters age. More inpatient observations, more medications, more clinical notes about compliance and pathology. The medical gaze had become an instrument of governance. When neighbors expressed worry, officials responded with reassurances about medical oversight. Thus the perfect veneer persisted, supported by institutional collusion. If you are listening, subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. Geographic naming helps map the spread of these mechanisms. The true violence here is procedural, slow, bureaucratic, and thus easily rationalized. Neighbors remember smiles on porches. Therapists later recorded dissociation in the same smiles. Memory is a contested field. Public memory preserves spectacle. Private memory preserves pain. The sisters' early photographs, identical dresses, synchronized poses, became artifacts in local scrapbooks, while clinical notes became archived evidence in university basements. Over time, those archives would tell two different stories, one of civic pride, the other of institutional complicity. When one sister tried to assert a future beyond the family enterprise, she was met with the double force of paternal rebuke and clinical skepticism. "She's not ready," they would say, citing developmental concerns and possible risk. Such pronouncements, when repeated, become restrictions dressed as care. The family's narrative was thus policed by a coalition of community expectation and professional authority. In the intimate moments between sisters, the truth was otherwise. They consoled one another, traded small secrets, and attempted to craft private plans that might allow escape. Those attempts were fragile and often failed. Opportunities for autonomy were systematically narrow-eyed. Scholarships deferred for appearances. Social invitations declined for study appointments. Friendships postponed for assessments. This slow tightening of options is one of the most insidious forms of control. It appears benevolent because it is explained as protection from uncertainty. The girl's adolescence was thus a series of postponed decisions, each delay reinforcing dependence. Subscribe and tell us which state you're watching from. Your comment is a public ledger entry in another currency. Witness. Ethical oversight failed to intervene effectively because the spectacle paid its own silence. By 20, the sisters were known as both trophies and case studies, a cruel bifurcation of humanity. The public rotations continued festivals, newspapers, civic honors interlaced with clinical appointments and academic conferences. The father cultivated this dual identity like a gardener pruning a plant to satisfy two different aesthetics. He took pride in the attention and used scientific validation to rebuff criticism. But validation is fragile when built on extraction. Inside, the sisters experienced fragmentation. One developed chronic anxiety, another cyclical depression, the third experienced episodes of psychosis, and the fourth a pervasive sense of derealization. Therapists attempted treatments in piecemeal fashion, while often ignoring structural contributors. Medication was introduced and changed in consultation with researchers who were eager to note physiological correlates. Case reports described symptoms in antiseptic tones, but anecdotes from caregivers recorded desperation and silence. The town continued to celebrate, conferring awards that read like obituaries of normal childhood. Meanwhile, the university used the case to justify broader studies, citing the quadruplets as an unparalleled resource in understanding psychopathology. Funding flowed, reputations rose. The girl's suffering, when raised by neighbors or family members, was often dismissed as private family matter or the inevitable cost of celebrity. This shifting of responsibility, from institutional to familial, allowed systemic issues to remain unaddressed. If you are watching, subscribe and tell us where you are in the comments. Your location is a small map of collective responsibility. The ledger keeps tally, but tallying is not justice. In silence, the girls taught themselves to be each other, like a chorus learning one melody to survive. They practiced mimicry as a defense. One would mirror another's expression to deflect attention, another would recite a script to satisfy a visiting researcher, and another would fall silent to avoid provoking the father's scrutiny. These survival techniques worked in the short term, but eroded core identity over months and years. The phenomenon of identity bleed emerges when distinct selves are trained to respond identically to external cues. Psychologists later described similar patterns in institutionalized groups, but often failed to connect the observation to the family's role as spectacle. When small acts of individuality surfaced, a preference for a particular book, a desire to study a subject not sanctioned by public appearances, they were curtailed, often by appeals to duty and financial necessity. The father's justifications were persuasive. He framed sacrifice as patriotism, as public service, and as a moral obligation to the town that had supported them. He weaponized gratitude and obligation to maintain control. Meanwhile, clinical staff documented dissociation increases but rarely pursued systemic solutions. Part of the trouble was that institutions had become complicit in normalizing monitoring as care, creating a circular logic: the more we study, the more we justify observation. The sisters' interior lives were thus eroded by both familial constraint and institutional normalization. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. Naming place is a public way to resist erasure. There is an anatomy to the slow disappearance of self, and it is made of mirrors and record-keeping. The deeper revelations came when redacted files were finally scanned, when paper became evidence of pattern. For years, legal and academic archives were sealed or coded, protective euphemisms guarding names and dates. But when advocates pressed and records were released, the margins revealed persistent threads, notes about parental control, clinical recommendations that prioritized data collection over protective intervention, and a stunning paucity of cross-disciplinary oversight. Histories that had been treated as isolated clinical curiosities revealed instead a network of enabling choices. Hospitals documented tests, universities documented consent forms, municipal records documented awards and proclamations. When compiled, they sketched a system in which authority and spectacle reinforced each other. The girls' personal letters, some preserved in private collections, showed glimpses of longing for ordinary experiences, A picnic, an unscheduled afternoon with friends, a life not arranged around observation windows. Those letters were small rebellions, often smuggled and sometimes destroyed. Activists and journalists who investigated later uncovered discrepancies between public narratives and private testimony. The father's ledger, when compared with municipal receipts and grant reports, showed how acceptance of gifts and public honors became leverage to silence critics. Scholars debated responsibility. Ethicists wrote papers about consent under conditions of social pressure, but only the sisters bore the lived consequences. If you feel compelled by this history, subscribe and tell us in the comments which state or country you're watching from. Your witness matters. The archives speak, but only if we choose to listen. Investigations would name failure as institutional blindness, the charm a spectacle, the stubbornness of patriarchal control. When independent reviewers combed the records, they found recurring motif deference to expertise even when expertise lacked ethical reflexivity, civic desire for prestige that outpaced moral inquiry, and a paternalism that equated control with protection. The Genain case became a cautionary tale in some circles, a story academics used to teach future clinicians about the pitfalls of research ethics. Yet the sisters themselves remained invisible in public discourse, often reduced to footnotes in scholarly debates. Their lived suffering rarely translated into systemic reform for decades. The investigations produced recommendations, improved consent procedures, more rigorous oversight of longitudinal studies, and clearer channels for whistleblowing. Some policies changed, but policy is slow and harm persists in lived habit. Meanwhile, the girls navigated adulthood with the residues of childhood performance, distrust of strangers, difficulty forming lasting relationships, and an internal library of accommodations that had kept them alive but not whole. Community memory remained split. Some retained pride in the novelty that had once brought the town attention, others, who had glimpsed the harm, felt shame. The case provoked uncomfortable questions about who we are as a society that prizes spectacle and applauds when science crosses the line into extraction. Subscribe and tell us where you are in the comments. Speak your location so this story is not anonymized into academic abstraction. There is an anatomy to complicity, and it lives in committees and applause. And yet, even with evidence, the story resists tidy endings, the damage is diffuse, and the culpability diffuse. Responsibility splinters across many actors: a father seeking status, a mother exhausted beyond measure, researchers pursuing knowledge, townsfolk hungry for miracle, and institutions with weak ethical guardrails. Each contributed to a structure that allowed harm to persist. Attempts at restitution were complicated. Legal claims met with statutes of limitation. Apologies were diluted by institutional hedging, and the sisters' desires for privacy conflicted with public demands for narrative closure. Some members of the family sought therapy, some entered state care, others withdrew entirely. The Genain case remained a key chapter in ethics training, yet it could not fully repair individual lives. The real question became less about single culpability and more about systemic responsibility. How do we build infrastructures that prevent extraction masquerading as care? How do we teach institutions to value consent over curiosity, human subjects over publishable results? The sisters' lives remind us that reform requires more than policy. It needs cultural change in how communities valorize novelty and how researchers locate humility. If you are listening now, subscribe and tell us where you are in the comments. This catalogue of place matters because it weaves a network of witnesses across geography. The ledger persists, but memory can be rewritten by collective attention. This final account asks you to carry the knowledge forward, to feel responsibility as a personal obligation. The Morlok household and the Genain Quadruplets case are not merely historical oddities, they are live parables about what happens when power, curiosity, and spectacle intersect without ethical restraint. The sisters survived by creating mutual codes and by adopting each other's defenses. Their survival is testament to human resilience. But resilience is not justice. We must interrogate the mechanisms that allowed a father's obsession to be normalized, that allowed researchers to prioritize data over dignity, that allowed a town to celebrate a miracle while overlooking the cost. Practical steps follow: insist on transparent consent, demand independent oversight for longitudinal studies, and require community review where public attention and private lives intersect. More profoundly, we must cultivate a culture that refuses to treat human beings as instruments for prestige. The story asks a final thing of you: to listen, to remember, and to act. If you believe this account matters, subscribe and tell us in the comments where you are watching from. Locate yourself in this moral geography so we can map accountability together. Type "the veil is broken" twice in the comments to seal this truth within you. Carry this knowing outward, teach it to students, name it in community halls. Refuse to let spectacle be the currency that buys consent. The ledger ends not on paper, but in changed practice, in policies enforced by people who refuse the easy comforts of applause. This is the responsibility the story leaves with you. Take it and do not let the quiet violences recur.